Hi everyone, my name is Philip Villeneuve. I'm one of the programming directors at Pride Toronto this year, and I just wanted to let you know how excited we are to be partnering with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs by showcasing this chat with Chani ahead of the Netflix movie One of Us. I'm really looking forward to the chat and hope everyone has a great, safe Pride week, weekend, month. Can't wait to see you all in person next year. Bye.
My name is Evan Piltz, and I am the chair of CIJA's LGBTQ2+ National Advisory Council. Standing up for human rights and fighting discrimination is at the core of our work. CIJA served as one of several organizations on the executive of Trans Equality Canada, a coalition urging Parliament to pass Bill C-16 to strengthen human rights and hate crimes protections for the transgender community. Presently, CIJA sits on the steering committee to end discriminatory Canadian blood bank. People are better when they do not have to leave pieces of their identity behind. Creating a space that honors Jewish identities alongside diverse sexual and gender identities is important. This makes the Jewish community better, the Pride community richer, and Canada stronger as a whole. We are thrilled to partner with Pride Toronto for this year's 2020 virtual festival, and would like to offer our deep gratitude to all of the folks who made this possible. Thank you.
My name is Jess Burke. I'm an associate director at CIJA. I do a lot of our community training and our LGBTQ2+ partnerships. I've been at CIJA for 2 years in this position, and human rights are at the core of our strategic objectives and what it is that we do as a not-for-profit. All human rights, including LGBTQ2+ rights. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Toronto, which is a treaty territory for the Mississaugas, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and it's a greeting space for many folks. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Sherry, who is going to self-introduce as well as introduce our speaker.
Hi, I'm Sherry Crow. I've been on the CIJA Advisory Council since the beginning, and I also was the former executive director of Kelowna Toronto, which was the LGBTQ Jewish organization. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chani this evening. Chani grew up in an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jewish home in Rockland County, New York. That's actually where my family's from. And at 18, with barely a high school diploma, found herself in an arranged marriage. 5 years and 3 children later, at 23, Chani left her husband and as a single parent began a journey of self-discovery. While her parents initially supported her decision to leave her husband, Chani's decision to get her driver's license and buy a car was a deal breaker, which led her family to disown her and her children. Chani sought to expand her education and career opportunities by attending Empire State College in New City, New York, while working full-time to support herself and her kids. After a few stops and starts, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in human development in 2006. She also completed a program called Coaching for Transformation, receiving certification as a life coach from the New York Open Center. She received ordination in 2009 from One Spirit interfaith minister, as deep spirituality called her to explore the many forms and expressions of the divine. Today, having mended fences and reconnected with her family of origin, Chani is a proud out gay parent, a spiritual leader and teacher, an established motivational speaker, spiritual counselor, and ritual creator. Since 2007, Chani has been facilitating a monthly support group for LGBTQIA women in New York City. As part of her work with the LGBTQIA community, she leads an annual weekend retreat that includes community building programs and workshops. In 2013, Chani joined the staff of Footsteps, an organization that helps individuals leaving ultra-Orthodox Judaism. She specifically supports members going through divorce and custody issues. Chani trains staff in different organizations that provide resources for Footsteps members, such as family law attorneys, social workers, and guidance counselors in colleges. Chani has been featured in 2 documentaries, One of Us, which is on Netflix, and Devout, which is on YouTube. It's my pleasure to introduce her with us this evening.
My name is Chani, and you just heard a little bit about me. Thank you very much. So Jess, I love the way you started. I wondered, if you had one question to ask that you wanted answered in the way that I'm speaking, what would that be?
I think people believe, especially with pop cultural understandings and renditions of films like Unorthodox and I Am One of Us, that you have to pick. If you pick your gayness that you are absolving yourself of your other identities, or that you've turned your back on them. This idea of self-compartmentalization, whether or not we sign up for it or whether somebody else designates it for us. I think a lot of people's questions exist in that realm because one of us really actually clearly says we were not set up for society and society was not set up for us. When we leave, we often end up in rehab or in jail. My burning question for you is, how did you even know what gay people were? When I was young, I grew up in a very insular household, and I remember going to a lesbian party when I was 16, and I saw women wearing boys' clothes and people with tattoos and women kissing women, and it was like I'd stepped into a portal of another dimension that I didn't understand. And I knew that I was gay, but I didn't know what that looked like. I thought I was the one person on earth for sure.
Of course, of course.
Everybody who leaves, they end up in jail or in rehab. They never make it out there.
I can't do it anymore.
If you don't show up in court, then you lose your children.
For years we've been retreating and retreating. We can no longer retreat.
Nobody leaves the Hasidic community unless they're willing to pay the price.
911, where's the emergency? There's people at the door banging down the door, and there's adult men outside, and I'm alone with the children. Do you know these people? They're my husband's family.
One of the things that people often think about is that we kind of separate our very different identities, and we operate in different spaces with different identities. So for example, we operate in our gay identity in queer-friendly spaces, and in our Jewish identity in Jewish-friendly spaces. Many, many times we operate in identities very specific to where we are and what is safe to be shown in that moment. I grew up as a Hasidic girl, and that meant that any time I acted outside of the gender norms that my family decided were female, my parents would say this comment in Yiddish, "Sei nicht, was du bist," which means don't be who you are. And I don't think that they meant to hurt me when they said that, but rather they didn't know how to handle it. It was an identity of mine that was not safe in my home. It was an identity of mine that was not safe in my community. It was an identity of mine that made it scary for them to raise a child that they didn't know what to do with, that didn't follow gender norms. In telling me to not act on that, they created a way in which I would figure out eventually how to act where and how to show up in different places at different times. And so I often wonder what makes us safe inside, and how do we show up for ourselves in a way that all of us can show up without needing to hide it, so that eventually we can be in places and bring our full selves. I'm going to give you an example of that in my own life. So I'm very out, and I'm very, my work is very related to my life story, both in terms of helping people leave ultra-Orthodoxy, both in terms of helping people come out. In my private practice, I work with a lot of people who leave formerly fundamental Christian or Muslims homes. Like, it's all kind of very similar trajectory, right? And so my life and who I am is very present in those spaces. But in my life and who I am, I also have a family of origin that I love. I have sisters who love me, at least in the way that they can. And when I go home, I dress up. And what that means is I dress in drag. I wear a skirt. I cover everything. I close my top button. I cover my hair. And when I see myself in the mirror, I don't look anything like how I feel. But I love my parents and I love my family. And so I show up in a way that might be, for some would say, that I'm hiding an identity. In reality, everyone in the room knows that I don't usually dress this way. My brother, his oldest son, was getting married. And they had what is called either an ofruf or a bavarfen, depending where you come, but it's like but it's the weekend before the kid gets married. They get called up to the Torah, you throw candies at them. It's a big celebration. It was the first grandchild for my parents, the first grandchild of my parents to get married, and they were so excited. And my brother kept inviting me for the entire Shabbat. And I told him, I love you, but I will be there for the ofruf. I will show up, and I'll be there for the meal after, but I can't be there the entire Shabbat. I can't come Friday night, and then Saturday morning, and then stay for the entire, till 7 p.m. He's like, this is like the first event that we have. I'd love to see you. And I looked at him and I said, Leibish, if I can come in pants and a nice shirt and uncover my hair, and everything else will be covered, but I'll be in pants and in a shirt, I can spend the entire Shabbat with you. But if you need me to be in drag, I top at 2 hours because I love you. So I can do that for 2 hours, but anything above that is topping it. And his response was, come for the ofruf. We'd love to have you. I could have said, I can't believe, I thought he wanted me there, and really what true love is, like accepting me exactly how I am. But I don't need that. I need to know that I'm okay. And for me, my max is 2 hours of drag. For some people, it's 5 minutes, maybe nothing. For other people, it's hours. It's really about understanding our own identity, understanding fully who we are, being integrated in ourselves, and then deciding how much we're willing to give for the people who can't accept us any other way. I love my family. I love my siblings. It's part of who I am. And for me, that means that I need to cover up in order to be with them. But I also love myself, and I know my max is 2 hours of drag. That's as long as I can handle it. What are your identities that you're trying to hold all together? What are the things that clash against each other? And how can you kind of find a way to integrate that, right? So when I left ultra-Orthodoxy, I didn't leave in one swoop. Many people do. They find something and they leave completely. I did it very slowly. I moved from Hasidic culture to yeshivish to modern Orthodox to eventually just Jewish. I let go of things only when I was fully comfortable to do so, because I integrated my new life with my old life. And I went back and forth continuously until I figured out something that felt comfortable for me. And I always knew that the way that I made decisions was that I would like myself the next morning after I'd made that decision. Because part of our identity is figuring out who we are. We don't only step into who we are and unpeel, right? We also have to figure it out. I love Michelangelo's quote where it's like, I chipped away at everything that wasn't David, and David emerged. But in order to know what to chip away from, I need to figure out if this is David or not. I remember when I was dating and somebody looked at me and said, you really expect to find a woman who would be willing to keep kosher in your house because your children are in modern Orthodox schools and be okay with you going to Sufi zikrs and Christian and Christian prayer and all kinds of different Jewish places and Hindu temples? And I looked at them and I said, yeah, I'm kind of crazy like that. Because for me, I wasn't willing to give up any of those pieces of me. Because all of who I am makes me me. I don't think that there's one person that can hold all of us. And I think that's why we need friendships in addition to intimate relationships, in addition to family and friends and all these different pieces that we have. But I do believe that each and every one of us can hold ourselves fully and become okay with the many different factors that make us who we are. And those factors are messy. You know, I was, at that time, I think I was still keeping kosher even outside the house. So here I am keeping kosher and going into a Sufi zikr. Sufi zikr is like the Kabbalists of the Muslims, right? It's like this place where there's ecstatic prayer and they're chanting Allah's name. And then afterwards you sit down for a meal. And I remember sitting around there and they were eating vegetarian and I thought to myself, why would I not share with the people I just prayed with? And that was the moment for me that I was ready to let go, because my desire for community and experiencing fully felt more important than some belief system around food. And so for each of us, we don't only integrate once, it's a constant evolution. Every day we learn, does this feel right or not? Does this feel comfortable or not? And how do I want to show up in the world? In this moment of time, as many of you know, in America, there's a huge uprising, and it reminds me of the uprising at Stonewall, where I believe her name was Stormy, was handcuffed because she was impersonating a man and she was dressed as a man. And she yelled out to the bystanders. And she said, as she was being handcuffed by the police, and she said, aren't you guys going to do something? And of course, nobody really knows exactly what happened at Stonewall, but the story, the myth tells us that Marshall, who was a self-identified queer person, threw the first brick. And then the uprising began. And Stormy always said, you can never call it a riot, because riots are people who are yelling for no reason. An uprising are people asking for change. And in the United States right now, that's what's happening. People are asking for racial justice. They're asking for change, because for too many years, there was silence. Each and every one of us silence parts of ourselves to fit in. It's time to show ourselves. It's time to be who we are. It's time to integrate.
Thank you so much, Chani. I have one question that I had asked you. So I'll ask first, and then maybe some other folks will have questions as well. My question, which was a little bit mirrored off my own experience, which we spoke of a little bit earlier, was how did you know you were gay? Or how did you discover gayness when you lived in a community that never mirrored that, where there was no visibility and no representation?
So after my second child, I needed to be in bed because health-wise, and I needed to kind of rest more than I was. My ex-husband bought us a TV, which is completely out of the realm in the Hasidic community, but he loved baseball, and it was a perfect excuse to get us a TV. And so it was like we hid it in our bedroom, and we had this TV. And I remember, and one of the reasons was because I was, I needed to be in bed longer than I was comfortable being. And if I watched TV, maybe I could, rest. It was right at the time Ellen DeGeneres came out. So what's that, like 20 years ago or something, I think? Maybe a little bit more than that. There was this episode, and there was a book on her table, and it said lesbian something. And everyone in the audience laughed. And I remember thinking, what is that word? And for some odd reason, I got up and I took out the dictionary. This is before Google existed. And I took out the dictionary and I looked up lesbian and it had someone who's attracted to the same sex, something like that. And I'm like, what sex? And I kept looking. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, interesting. I guess that's who I am. My ex came home at the time, that night or whatever that day, and I said to him, I think I'm a lesbian. And he says, what's that? And I kind of like walk him through the same thing. He says, yeah, I think you are. And we continued living together. So, I came out to myself, I came out to him, and we just yeah, it is who you are. It was very clear that's who I was, and I was attracted to women, and okay. I left him for reasons other than my sexuality. But once I left him and began to discover who I was and what I needed, because I now can ask questions. My marriage was arranged. I never asked any questions. But once I left him, I began to ask the questions of what kind of life do I want to lead? And realizing that the system I was raised in didn't protect me or take care of me. A year before I left him, I started therapy. And the first thing I actually said to my therapist was that I was gay, and was she okay with that? And can we, at some point, we might need to deal with that, right? So that was my thing. But and then once I left him, it became really clear that there was no space for me in the Hasidic community in terms of being gay. And for a long time, I stayed Orthodox and religious and kept showing my face because I wanted people to know. And I always feel like real change in communities happen from within. And I know that I touched a lot of lives and I shifted a lot of people because I was out and I lived amongst them. I think my belief system changed and I just wasn't willing to be that rigid anymore. And so I had to figure out a way that incorporated my life and my belief system and the questions that I was asking. And I do belong to a synagogue. I know that in a lot of people who leave completely. I belong to a synagogue, but when you open their page now, just want to read to you what it says because it's so awesome. On the banner, when you open their website, it says, in this congregation we believe Black Lives Matter, love is love, no human is illegal, women's rights are human rights, science is real, all genders are whole, holy, and good, religion is a choice, kindness is in everything, and justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so I was able to find a place that had my values. I can live them in a more full way. But that's how I came out. I came out because Ellen had a book on her show that made me ask questions.
Thank you.
There's a chat. Do you want me to
Yeah, go ahead. There's a question there for you.
The question is, do you feel that you are still able to have an impact in the Hasidic and or Orthodox community now that you are openly OTD? No, absolutely not. At the same time, actually, I shouldn't say no, absolutely not. That's my initial reaction is no, absolutely not. The reality is that as much as people put me down and as much I'm othered by the community, there are people who know and see me or are my family, and they come to my home, and my very life changes their life because I'm not on drugs, and that's what they say that was going to happen. They say you're going to get on drugs, you're going to die out there. If somebody doesn't kill you, you'll kill yourself. Right? There's a huge conversation that is in the Hasidic community that they say this is going to happen if you do that, right? And my very existence and living, and people knowing that I live with my partner, is very different. My sister remarried, and we went to her wedding, and I was there with my partner, and the Rebbitzin from my parents' shul was oh, who's because we were all in blue gowns, and she's who's that person, right? And so I said, oh, that's the woman I live with. And it's very clear that I wasn't hiding it, but it was also so uncomfortable for her. Even as uncomfortable it was for her, she saw us together. She saw us healthy. She saw us thriving. She saw the way the kids call her Ima, right? She saw these things. She saw the things that make a family a family. And that's hard to write off. My very existence and my very ability to live, healthy life destroys the narrative they say about me. Question, has my relationship with God changed after you came out? My relationship with God is continuously changing. It's not only about whether I came out. I think my relationship with God started changing before that, but definitely changed. I was young when I came out. I had my first child at 19 and my second at 20, so I was like 20 years old. In a very insular community. I think if anybody had told me anything about being gay, I would have been out years ago, because I kissed my first friend at 12 and continued kissing girls throughout. But in terms of like my relationship with God, I think that for me, as I matured, God couldn't be a man in the sky. And I think that for anyone really, as we mature, we teach children certain things because it's very concrete and because that's all they can see. But as we developed, our consciousness changes, and God becomes more of what we need God to be, and what spirit is and isn't in terms of us, and what consciousness is and what energy is, and how that interacts in our world and in our life. And for each one of us, more than just who or what is God, is how do I interact with that? It's not only because I came out, it's because of my identity, in terms of my gender, in terms of my way of being, or the way that I see human beings hurt each other. And I have to ask, is that really in the name of God? And which God is that anyway? It's really about the small, still voice inside of us. And how do we connect with that? And so it changes, it morphs, it shifts. And I shift and change, and then I have to reshift again, right? So it's kind of a messy place to be. Can you tell us a bit about the work you do with Footsteps and whether helping others has impacted your own healing journey? So I didn't want to work at Footsteps. Let's start there. But sometimes our partners bring out the best in us. And my partner decided that we should go to a volunteer event at Footsteps. And she is very persistent. And so I went, and I sat in the corner and I was just like listening. And at the end of it, Lonnie, the executive director, came over and said, "Hey, I know you, you're Chani better." And we started having a conversation, and one thing led to another. And then I started working at Footsteps for 10 hours a month. Now I'm there 32 hours a week, just for context, right? So it took a while. Footsteps heals probably my deepest wounds, but it also triggers them. Because when we work with the people we identify with the most, both show up. And holding both is very complicated. The work I did at Footsteps is that I ran our family justice program, which basically meant that I would speak to people who were divorcing, thinking about divorcing, or had divorced and had children, and were trying to stay in touch with their children. And by that, I don't even mean custody. Of course, many of them are fighting for custody, but I'm talking about contact, talking to their children, interacting with their children, just contact. And the way that the Jewish-based in and also the legal court system in New York has taken those rights away, and the reasons that they do it. And so my original job was just to see how we can help. Like, that was the beginning, and just helping people through that. Eventually we created some partnerships with legal organizations who can represent our clients. We hired a legal strategist who can help educate lawyers and judges, hopefully one day. And we also created a fund that if somebody needed, say, transcripts from the court proceedings, that they can have that money. my role at Footsteps was to speak to the individual and to do more of like case management. So if they needed a therapist, either to find them a therapist outside or to find them a therapist within our clinical team who can work with them, then get them the attorney and like put all the pieces in place, or at least I say there's no way we can do all the pieces, but some of the pieces in place for them to have an easier journey and to feel less alone. And I also run support groups for parents who are in divorce cases, or parents who are single parents, or parents who are figuring out how to co-parent with another parent who's not religious. I also do support groups with parents who are who have no contact with their kids, not necessarily because the court stopped them, but rather because the kids are adults and have made a decision to choose religion over their parent. That's the work that I do at Footsteps. Can you speak about your involvement, participation, role in One of Us? Yes. When the directors came to us and they said, we've been wanting to do a documentary. They do a lot of documentary around fundamental religion, but I'm wanting to do a documentary around Orthodoxy. We're wondering how you feel about it. And I and Lonnie spoke to most of staff, and we kind of talked about it, and we were really worried about our members. And so we made a decision to only let them into the space if we told the members they were going to be there. So if there was ever a drop-in group, we would tell members, these directors who are looking for people to do a movie, to do a documentary, they're going to be in this event. If you're interested, come and talk to them. And so like we first of all, they were there for about a year and a half in our space in different events, getting to know the members before they ever started filming. They really took their time, and then once they started filming, it was very deliberate. Our members had safety and didn't feel exposed unless they were comfortable being on camera. One of the people they started following was Etty, and so when they began to follow her, I was working with her because it was a family justice case. At some point, I don't remember which one of them asked me, like, how do you feel if we interview you since you're on tape anyway? And that's kind of how it happened. We were a smaller staff at the time. We're a much bigger staff now, but we were a smaller staff at the time. I was very involved in Etty's case. I also come from that community, so it just felt like the right fit. And they were like, hey, would you be willing? So I was completely not involved in the editing of it or the way that it was produced, none of that. I was just there doing my job. And then the moment in the synagogue where you see me hugging Etty, that was just an organic moment. Other than that, they came to my office and they asked me specific questions and I talked about it.
Does your family know that you were in a documentary, 2 documentaries?
So I think some of them do. Many of them don't, because my family is extremely Hasidic and don't really watch anything. But I was at my nephew, that same nephew that I was telling you about. I was at his wedding, and a few of my first cousins. But so I have to preface, I have over like 200 first cousins. But a few of my first cousins came over and were like, "I saw you," and it was the first time I realized that they actually saw me in like a talit and kippah and like. It's one thing when you know that your cousin is OTD, off the derech, or whatever you want to call it, like that I'm no longer religious. It's much worse for them that I'm wearing a kippah and a talit, because to them, I am desecrating holy garments, not using it for holiness, which is what I was doing, right? It's because I just like, this is how I pray. When my cousins came over and said, hey, I saw you at One of Us, and I noticed that they saw me in that kippah and talit, and how shocking that must be for them, much more than if they saw me in shorts and a t-shirt. I think that was the first time I realized how much of an impact the film actually had. And also to the question that someone asked me before about, do I think that I'm still influencing? And I do, because they saw me like that. And there's no way that they can see me in the way that I am praying and not know that I'm praying. You know, it reminds me of a story. I was my high school class's 10-year anniversary, and it was the last one I actually went to, but we were all sitting together, and I was already, you know, a single mom at the time, and they all had a bunch of kids, and we got together, and there's this custom that when people get together, you give a Devar Torah, which is you speak holy words of Torah. You kind of make sure that, you know, just sitting around and having a good time. So all of a sudden, like the Rebbitzin of our class turns around and says, oh my goodness, we didn't ask anybody to prepare a Devar Torah, and it's getting to the end of the night, and we're gonna bench, which is we're gonna say the grace after meals, and we didn't have a Devar Torah. And I said, give me a minute, what parsha is it? What Torah portion? And I opened it up, and I kind of found a chumash, and I opened it up, and I figured something out, and I shared something. And that same Rebbitzin came over to me. She said, you didn't hear this from anybody. You made this up, right? So it's not like I came out and I said, this and this rabbi made this and this comment about this Torah portion, and that's what I'm sharing with you, right? I said, no, of course not. I looked at the Torah portion. I made one up. Like, that's what Devar Torah is. And I remember thinking that although I was the only woman in that class who was driving, we were 50 girls graduated high school. And I was the only one who drove a car because women don't drive where I come from. When it came time to say a Devar Torah, they knew to call on me. And that is priceless. Okay. Any other questions?
This is going to be part of Pride Toronto's virtual festival, and a lot of people are never going to have met someone Jewish, let alone never going to have met someone Hasidic or formerly Hasidic. Could you maybe explain to a broader audience what that looks like in the traditional sense or in your backgrounds?
So in a traditional sense, Hasidim emerged in the 18th century as a response to intellectual Judaism, where everyone had, in order to be someone in the Jewish community, you had to be learned, you had to have money in order to learn. And so Yisrael Baal Shem Tov decided that it was hard for the masses to connect through intellect. And so he began to sing, and he would teach people that simple people, as long as we connected through spirit, that was enough to connect you to God. That was his thing. He was very much, story-wise, there are many stories that are told about him. It's this incredible, dynamic individual who would go around to little town and villages and sing and dance with people and remind them that the essence of who they were was much, much, much greater than that the essence of who they were is much greater than how much they knew about Torah. So that's really how Hasidic culture came about. And the Misnagdim, the yeshivish community during that time, were very against him, actually. And it was a movement, and then eventually it became a bigger movement, and right before World War II, it was actually dying out quite a bit. There were less and less Hasidim during that time. And then the Holocaust happened in Europe, and many, many people lost loved ones and families and friends, and came here to the United States as well as to Israel. And most of them were teenagers because they were the ones who could survive the camps. And they needed parents, and they needed community, and they needed family. And so some of the rabbis had been smuggled out because their Hasidim at the time paid good money for them to be smuggled out in different ways. And some of them actually survived the camps. Different rabbis had different stories. But all of a sudden, these orphans who needed homes, a rabbi came and said, I'm going to recreate for you the shtetl you left behind. You know, Hasidic Williamsburg was created, and then eventually And so two pieces came out of that. One was that people did get community in a deep way, but some of these rabbis were fanatics and pressed, and almost every person in those communities were trauma survivors. And in the beginning, Hasidic communities were not so big. They were just like, ragtag of people who had come together after the Holocaust and created families, but they were trying to recreate the families that they left home, and they were trying to make enough children to have the 6 million. And so they just started having a ton of children, and these children had more children. And this is now generations of trauma who are taught from a very young age that you need to be afraid of the other. And the more people they had, the less they needed the outside. And so they could create an entire economy only internally. And they could create an entire community internally, and they could support each other. And it is extremely supportive and extremely loving. When my mother had cancer, my mother knew that people were going to feed her family, which they did. Neighbors brought over food. Somebody else drove my mother to chemo treatment. Somebody else made sure that the doctor bills were paid. I mean, this is a community that truly 100% shows up if you follow their rules. But they are also terrified of other. And that takes a huge toll, both for the people born into it and those who experience them. And so when I think about the Hasidic community, I think about an insular community, at least in this day and age, an insular community that was born out of Holocaust and trauma and really hasn't been able to see outside of it and perpetuates that in their own way.
So Suzanne has said, thank you for talking about trauma's impact on the culture of fear of the other. I think that is true in the mainstream Jewish world as well in some ways. And we have a question. Do you ever worry that your perspective or the general perspectives of Hasidim on TV paint a negative picture of Jewish people?
It's so interesting because people have been asking me this a lot, like since One of Us came out. And I hadn't thought about that before One of Us came out, but Netflix was very worried, and they had a few non-Orthodox rabbis look at it, and they were really worried before Netflix was put out. Netflix was really worried before One of Us was put out. I don't. I believe that if we tell stories that are authentic and real, that most people will connect with them. Because storytelling is the way that we connect. I could have started with you today and just talked about identity as this lofty idea. Instead, I told you about my gender. I think that there isn't one way to look at ultra-Orthodoxy. It's a complex system. There are many different people in it. And systems in general are complicated when we look at them as one person's story and not as the whole of what systems create, because systems are much greater than the numbers that they represent. But I do think that we have to start telling our stories. Hiding them because we're afraid only perpetuates them more.
What does your Judaism look like now?
It's complicated. It's very complicated. I love God. I love Judaism. I actually teach it. I teach very I don't teach so out of the box, but according to Orthodoxy, I would be teaching very out of the box. But I put on tefillin. It's a spiritual practice that I do. I write myself in Italy and I pray with them. There are Hasidic nigunim that still guide me. I create Shabbat meals and belong to a synagogue that is very socially justice oriented. Actually, I see it as a lens in which I see things, but I don't see it as the only thing. And so it's one of the many ways I interpret the world is through my Jewish lens, through my queer lens, through my, like I was a single mom for a long time. So there's a way in which I interpret the world as a single mom lens, which is very different than people who are partnered and have children. There's just like as a parent, there are lenses in which I see the world, and Judaism is one of those lenses. It's part of who I am, and it's a complicated piece. I think we also need to understand how trauma lives in our body more than just in our own, but that generational trauma lives in our body and how that's impacted. And I think that that's a lot of Bessel van der Kolk's work. He talks about both how trauma lives in our own body by going through trauma, but also like generational trauma and how that lives in our body. And I think that that's important to understand. And I think once we start understanding that, we can just begin to imagine internally, like, oh, and what happens if a community is traumatized, and then just kind of keeps perpetuating that same thing. Okay, so how old were you when your children, when you left? I can imagine that the experience of leaving would have very difficult for adults to understand that. I'm curious. Yeah, so my children were young when I originally left their dad. My son was almost 5. My daughters were 3 and 18 months old. So on some level, I grew up with them and we changed together. So on some level, it's easier to explain it to kids when you're growing together and you're figuring it out together than if you're doing it once they're grown. I still think it was very complicated for them because their father and his family are very Hasidic. My family is Hasidic, and there's a lot of questions around where do I belong in community if my people are this and I live this world, right? And so part of my work at Footsteps, so glad you asked this question, is actually what we call second gen, which is really generation 1.5, because these kids were born into Hasidic parents and are growing up as one parent is leaving while the other is staying. And some of them by court order have to stay in Hasidic schools. Some of them are in public schools, but they go back to the Hasidic parent, right? So there's like all a different mix. And we have a support group for them, and we talk about real issues with them. And we allow them to notice that they're not alone. And I remember the first time we did the group, this was the very first time we did the group, I looked around the group and I said, so I'm wondering, which one of you have one Hasidic, one religious parent and one not? That's how I framed it, because some of them are Hasidic, some of them are yeshivish. And one kid's hand went up like this, because he was really scared. And then this girl's hand went up. And then all of a sudden, every single hand shut up. And they were shocked. The shock on their face that there were other people like them, because the ones who were in public school, they talked about how nobody in their public school understood what it was like to go back to the other parent. And the one that were in Hasidic schools, nobody in their community could understand what it's like to go and maybe not keep Shabbos or not keep kosher or sit around with men and women together or whatever it was, right? So like these kids didn't believe that there were other kids who were experiencing, and they looked around the room, and that surprise and joy. And so we do this, it's a monthly group, it's called Second Gen, and they show up and different kids come in, and now they already know, like, this is a safe place, and they come in with questions. Like sometimes I'll ask and I'll say, okay, anybody have any specific questions? And one of them says, so I've been thinking this, Mom, and they just like go in because they know that this is the group they can talk to. And one of them actually asked me once, she's like, why do you do this group? I said, because my kids didn't have it. And that's true. Like, that's why I do this group, because my kids didn't have it. Does it ever get less strange to share such intimate stories of your life with strangers? It must have been terrifying at first. It is less so now. It's an interesting reality. I think the first time I spoke might have been in Toronto. No, it wasn't the first time. I had spoken before that, but I did speak, like one of my first talks were about 13 years ago in Toronto, but I think I spoke before that. I spoke because I wanted to make a change. I was fed up about something. And I went to speak to people and I realized we were in a room. We were just like in someone's dining room. And I realized that by sharing my story, they would hear the humanity of why LGBTQ rights needed to change. And that if I hid behind it someone else's story, then they wouldn't be impacted. And I remember making that decision to speak from like a place of like, you need to understand what it's like to live this experience and be so afraid. And I realized that I had a way with words, that I had a way of connecting with people. And so I said yes. And every single time before I say yes, I think about it. I don't say yes quickly. Before I was on Devout, the two filmmakers were students and they had found me and they wanted to do the film and they started talking to me and I was like, no, thank you. And then I said, by the way, I'm leading services at Romumu in New York City. If you really want to meet with me in person, come down on, Friday night, finishing services. I think it was like 6:30 to 8. I said, we'll talk at 8 if you really want to talk to me, but I'm not making time to even talk to you. And there was this Christian woman and her Muslim friend in the Jewish synagogue that I was leading services. And they didn't come at 8. They showed up at 6:15 before services. They introduced themselves. We had a conversation. And then we talked at 8. And that made me say yes to Devout. And I didn't know that that's what I would need to say yes to it and to allow people into my home. But I knew that when they showed up in that way, I said, okay, I could do this. And the same thing was with one of us. I mean, we as a staff Foots of staff talked a lot about what it would mean to let people in. But it was how they showed up and the way that they were willing to be in the background for a long, long time before they even picked up a camera, making friends with the people that they were going to film and really being honest to the project that made us say yes. The truth is, none of you are strangers because each and every one of us have a story. And sometimes when I walk in the city, I haven't done that in a long time because of COVID, but when I went into the city to work, I would look around after I came out of the New Jersey Transit, and there would be hundreds of people leaving the train. And I would think each one of them have a story. Every single person walking here has a longing. I wonder what they are. And each one of you showed up because you have a longing and a story and a question. And I believe in the human spirit much more than I do in strangers. If you were all strangers, I couldn't share like this. We're all longing for something. And in that longing, I allow myself to be vulnerable so that you could see me and perhaps through me see yourself.
Chani, thank you so sincerely. I see that a thank you is here in the chat. And thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. I know some folks have watched the documentaries. I know other people will embark upon it. And thank you so much for being willing to put out your email and to connect with folks. I know that everyone will probably have more questions. I also want to thank you for making the time this evening and for sharing your story on a queer Jewish personal level amongst us folks, and then for also being part of something bigger. And I look forward to sharing that with you. So a big thank you from all of us.
You're so very welcome. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.